look at the Zoom. Okay, so she's just going to tell us when we're live and then we start. I assume.
Well, what's in the chat? You're live.
Okay, great. Um, so greetings, happy Friday. I am Mo Tasic. I'm the investigations editor of the American Prospect, and welcome to our weekly YouTube live stream of the Behind the Headlines. I am joined today by my wonderful colleague, Bill McGee of the American Economic Liberties Project, formerly of Consumer Reports, and we're going to go through some of our favorite headlines. Of course, both of us have a real vested interest in the future of Boeing and American air travel and global air travel. Um, and Boeing was in the news a lot this week, including, which is not unusual. It's sort of been in the news every week this year. But there were two really compelling hearings in the Senate on Boeing on Wednesday, so we'll probably talk about that. Hope to get to the landmark UAW vote in the VW plants in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and that's supposed to be a really big. It's expected to go well, or there's a lot of optimism, but there usually is. Previously, the last two attempts to organize VW in the United States, which is the only country in which VW operates where it's not unionized, have been really, really close. So hopefully Sean Fain will push that over the finish. We'll be talking about Live Nation. It's not something that is one of Bill's areas of expertise, but he knows all about ticketing because he is the world's leading authority on airlines. So Bill understands that dynamic a lot. And then, of course, there is the war that we are now inexorably headed into, the regional war in the Middle East that I suppose we are joining to sort of distract the public from the more localized war in Gaza, or more the localized siege of Gaza, and its the accompanying genocide or accused alleged genocide that has accompanied that. So I don't really know anyone who is in favor of this war, but our opinions don't seem to matter, and it's not an area where either Bill or I have had much luck um, uh, influencing our policymakers. So, alas, I don't know how much good we can do on that discussion, but we're happy to answer any reader questions. Um, and so I think that we'll probably start with Boeing. Oh, also, of course, the Key Bridge collapse. There were some developments on that. Bill is a transportation expert, so we'll probably touch on that because it is very much analogous to the dysfunction at Boeing. It's the dysfunction throughout all of our modes of transportation. So Bill, why don't we start with what we know about, which is uh, which is air travel. And I would love to get your take on this week's hearings. Did you watch them? What were you looking for? Were you surprised by anything? Does anything surprise you these days?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on, Mo. You're one of my favorite colleagues too, and I'm really happy to be here with you. And by the way, I just want to give you a public shout out. I've been involved in investigative journalism on aviation safety for many years, and the job that you've been doing for Prospect has just been, you've really been killing it. So I read everything you're putting out. So congrats on that. Keep it up. So Boeing, yeah, I cover any kind of hearing that has to do with airlines and aviation, but I don't think I've ever seen two concurrent hearings. They were running against each other. One started an hour after the other one before the first one finished, both in the Senate the other day. One was in Senate Commerce, and the other one with Senator Blumenthal had,
Permanent, yeah.
I think it got the it got more attention because of the Boeing whistleblowers who were there, and just absolutely compelling testimony. I think just about everybody probably saw clips either on social media or in the news or what have you. It's testimony that I think blows a lot of people's minds. Quite frankly, not mine, because I've been, immersed in this world for so many years. I don't think I could be surprised by anything that emerges out of aviation in the United States at this point. I know that sounds very cynical, but it's just how it is. But in many ways, the Senate Commerce hearing, which was focused on the designee program at the FAA, the ODA system, in many ways, I think it was more important. It was less flashy,
Mhm.
and it wasn't, it wasn't going to compel the headlines. The witnesses were not up there saying that they were, getting death threats and, worried about their safety and things like that. They were academics and safety experts. But and I hope, we'll talk some more about this, but to me, and I just wrote about this for Farmers last week, we cannot fix Boeing until and unless we fix the Federal Aviation Administration. Because, and as you know, as well as anybody, there's a ton of problems at Boeing, and everything from, the board to the executive suite, all of it. It all needs to be fixed. The corporate culture needs to be fixed. It's been corrupted since the McDonnell-Douglas merger in 1997. It needs, top to bottom house cleaning in so many ways. It's a big job. It'll take years. But from my perspective, having spent years analyzing the FAA. I'm not trying to plug a book, but my book, Attention All Passengers, focuses largely on the FAA and oversight. In the airline industry, there's a term that's used by frontline employees, even within the FAA in lower ranks. They refer to the FAA as the tombstone agency, because the thinking is that far too often problems are on the radar. They're aware of them, but they wait until something fatal happens to act on them. So fixing the FAA, and I hope we can talk a little bit more about that, I think is essential to fixing Boeing. I'm not saying it's one or the other, and I'm in no way, no, let me be, all caps on this, no way excusing Boeing. But fixing Boeing won't be enough if we also don't have effective oversight.
Well, I mean, I think that, I think it's really important to make that point because basically we don't have a say. That's not how capitalism works.
Right.
There has been this really intense and clearly well-funded, although I don't know who's funding it, sort of lobbying campaign playing out in the business press to pitch Larry Culp, the current GE CEO, or more recently Steve Mollenkopf, I'm probably mispronouncing this name, a former Qualcomm CEO, for this job. Neither of those gentlemen are engineers. Both are probably improvements on Dave Calhoun, the also ex-GE and Blackstone executive who's been leading Boeing for the past 3 years or so. But it's not, these are really very milk toast and again, MBA ideas. And, it sort of it brings me to this bigger problem, which is that is there a CEO out there who can turn this company around? The last great hope Boeing had, I think, for an old school CEO who really understood how to build an airplane, um, was why am I like I'm blanking on his name? A wonderful guy who used to be, well, he, wonderful as CEOs go, but the former CEO of Ford. He had been at Boeing, I think, for like 36 years.
Right.
Um, and I was looking him up, Roger Mullally. All right.
Lolly, right, yeah.
Alan Mullally, sorry. Alan Mullally, a really great guy. If you see him, you can watch him in this PBS documentary about the development of the 777, which was sort of the like high point for Boeing engineering. Alan Mullally wasn't perfect, but he was definitely somebody that every engineer in the company respected, and that wasn't just like the absolute opposite of this of a kind of financialized, like cost cutting, short-term stock price, get on my private jet type. And he is, I think he's 79 years old. So,
Mm.
you know, he's a little too old. No one's been bringing him up. But over, during the Max crisis in 2019, everybody brought him up and said, maybe we can bring him back. But again, 79, we know what it looks like. And it, um, I some 79-year-olds. So speaking of Boeing, Ralph Nader is somebody obviously who enters these conversations quite frequently, despite being almost 90 at this point.
Mm.
And he's extremely lucid. I don't think he's in the best health, but I don't want to be ageist. But a huge problem with Boeing is that they need to bring back as many veterans who understand how to properly build an airplane as they can, before all of those guys are just too old, and the expertise dies with them. Because
Right.
the fundamental problem that Boeing has right now is that there are just too few. They've iced them all out. They've blacklisted them. They've retaliated against them. They've fired them. In the case of Sam Salapur, one of the whistleblowers who testified, they again, leave him threatening messages. He had a nail driven into his one of his tires and he lost control of his car on the road and gone to, and it was, his tires I think were a month old at that point. And he went in and they said, this didn't happen by accident, sort of, do you
Right.
have any enemies?
Right.
They said, oh, that's interesting. I guess that did happen at work. And that was how they started the hearing, which I thought was interesting. It seems like they are superficially anyway taking seriously the absolute toxicity of the culture at Boeing
Right.
and what happens to you if you bring up any of these issues. But the problem is that there are just so many of them. And it was really interesting to hear all of these senators say, wait a second. At one point, they discussed the 737 MAX, and Pearson, a longtime Ed Pearson, who was a manager at the Renton 737 Max plant, um, and left after writing a really scathing memo about it, and just suggesting that they needed to shut down operations. He brought up the fact that the Max crashes were not entirely caused by the MCAS software, right? Because what had activated the MCAS software inaccurately was the failure of these angle of attack sensors. And he described, the first angle of attack sensor on the Lion Air flight that crashed in Indonesia, October 31st, 2018. He that had been recently replaced. They didn't recover the one that was broken, but it had been the one that it had that had initially been installed on the plane was, had frayed wires and all of these real problems mechanically. And then he suggested that with the second, they immediately blamed a bird strike for running off the angle of attack sensor on the Ethiopian Airlines Max that crashed on March 10th, 2019. And he said they had no evidence of that. He thought that they made it up in order to, narrow that investigation to the software that malfunctioned. Well, the senators were not ready to hear this. They thought they understood why the Maxes crashed, and it is absolutely true that the MCAS software was just still unfathomably poorly written. And it didn't really make any sense. And we can go through all of the errors that led to that. But he was bringing up something equally, equally culpable for killing those 346 people, and no one had really thought about it before. And just the litany of problems that these three whistleblowers brought up with with the various planes, and not just the 737 Max, but now the 787 Dreamliner. which is what Salapur worked on. Um, it was a lot. It was a lot for the senators to take in. They couldn't quite handle the fact that, like, you know, oh, they were getting new information. And so I think that that was one of the real, you know, lessons, was that this is something that is too complex, and obviously for senators to quite wrap their heads around. There was a lot of like, wait a second, you know, happening with the senators, and I thought that you know, you need a functioning regulatory agency that can handle that kind of complexity. And the FAA used to be that agency. And, you know, there was a lot of, um, there was an FAA whistleblower who explained kind of, you know, what had happened in the agency. We have a question from Anthony now. The Boeing whistleblower who died by gunshot seemed to say that virtually all of the real talent had been pushed out by the past CEO. Do you think this is true? If so, how can Boeing rebuild? And is the Biden administration taking any steps to fix the AA, or are they avoiding the problems?
Why don't you take
So,
the first one and I'll take the second one? How's that?
yeah. Why don't you? Well, yeah, and so yeah, has all the talent been pushed out by the past CEO? I wouldn't say that it's just the past CEO. I think that honestly, the story, the McNerney was probably the longest serving of the GE CEOs from 2005 to 2015. I think he was at Boeing. A real slash and burn type of guy. He hated the unions. He welcomed their hatred. He moved the production of the 787 to South Carolina.
Right.
Just
Right,
a
right to
real
work state. Yeah.
and yeah, I mean, I think that he pushed a lot of people out, but everybody, I mean, just over the past 3 years, I think Boeing has lost an enormous amount of, I think, you know, over 1,000 machinists who had an average time at the company of 23 years. So, you know,
Yeah.
that is,
It's a brain drain. Exactly. Yeah.
and yeah, and that was definitely that was definitely intensified after COVID, when they needed that bailout. They
Right.
floated a monster bond, and then they laid off a whole shit ton of employees. And you know, the people who, you know, take the buyouts are the ones who have been there a while and
Right.
have some benefits to enjoy. So it's a real problem. So on to the Biden administration and the FAA. Interested to hear.
Sure. So this is what I'm currently working on for economic liberties, is we're putting together a paper to say that we're at a crossroads right now. Some of us have been out there for a long time saying that the FAA has been understaffed and underfunded for more than 40 years, going back to the Reagan administration. I mean, I wrote about this in my book, and that was 12 years ago. The problem has only gotten worse. We have more and more flights, more and more work for the FAA, and fewer inspectors. Now, to be really clear, this paper that we're putting together, we want to send it to Congress and to the White House because they're the ones that control budgets. Probably, I rank among those who have been most critical of the FAA over the years. And but you know, the bottom line is the FAA administrator and even the DOT secretary, as powerful as they are, they don't control budgets, right? That's not how it works. And so to me, you know, to be really honest, Mo, I don't look at this as a political issue because when you have 7 presidents in a row all follow the same policy and half of them are Democrats, half of them are Republicans, that's not political to me. This isn't red and blue. This isn't, you know, this isn't, well, it's Obama or it's Trump. It's everybody, right? It goes back to Reagan. So we as a nation, we've been saying one thing and doing another. We say publicly, the White House says it, Congress says it, FAA says it, that we have zero tolerance for accidents and fatalities, that safety is paramount. And then we continue to underfund and understaff the FAA. So what I'm doing right now as we speak is working on this paper and crunching numbers to say, okay, these designee programs, they're an absolute failure. What are the designee programs? Like ODA, and there are a couple of others. What it means is that you are a Boeing employee. You're working on the factory floor. You're a mid-level manager, and you work for 2 bosses. You get paid by Boeing, and yet you're supposed to be the eyes and ears of the FAA because they don't have enough inspectors. Well, that's untenable. It's something that simply doesn't work. Imagine having to go forward and tell your boss, you know, in aircraft manufacturing, millions of dollars quickly become billions of dollars, right? When you have a problem. So you have to
Right.
say, well, we have to halt this assembly line. We have to delay deliveries to airlines all over the world who are going to be very, very ticked off about it, right? And it's going to cost a ton of money. This is not acceptable. And you've worked with whistleblowers. I've worked with whistleblowers. They're some of the bravest, and I never throw around the word hero, but some of them to me are heroes. People that I worked with on my book that work in airline maintenance and at the FAA. But think about it. Every time I hear a whistleblower story, like we've been hearing at Boeing, some of this shocking testimony, you know what my first thought is? For every person that steps forward, how many never step forward, right? Think about that. Because whistleblowers are rare. It takes a rare type of courage and commitment to say, okay, I'm going to put my career and maybe even my life on the line, right? And my family's welfare and all the rest of it. So not everybody's going to do that. So this is unacceptable to have these designees. So we're saying let's not dance around this. This is going to involve some money. But before people start yelling, oh well, typical progressive solution, throw money at the government. No, we're saying this isn't, it's going to cost money, but we're trying to make some very practical suggestions. The ODA program hasn't worked, and we need to replace them with real live inspectors. And they're not in the pipeline. They need to be trained because they haven't been hiring.
What I don't understand is why when Boeing commits crimes and has to pay, settlement money to the government, as it did in the case of the MAX crashes, and they ended up getting this deferred prosecution agreement that was
Right,
um, Ed Pearson said criminal in his testimony. I certainly agree. It reached to high heaven. It was announced on January 6th, or it was signed on January 6th, 2021, announced the following day. A complete disaster. But the FAA fined Boeing to the tune of some $500 million, let's say.
right,
Why can't they use that money to fund their I mean, this is the thing that I really don't understand is why when these companies break the law, which Boeing breaks the law. I mean, this is what I've learned from these whistleblowers is that these laws are very specific
right,
about how record keeping is supposed to be handled. And Ed Pearson also alleged a criminal cover up of the 1282 investigation. He said that he had been given by a fellow whistleblower the records of who actually worked on that particular plane on reinstalling Son's bolts,
right,
that door plug. And he, and he said that they've told the NTSB, Boeing has told the NTSB they don't have those records. Maybe,
right,
they,
which
they
is
just went somewhere
unacceptable.
else.
Right,
They also overwrote the surveillance video. Honest mistake, I promise. And so there is now another criminal investigation that's been opened into Boeing. I do think that even though the deferred prosecution agreement was as weak as they come and a real travesty, you can read my story about how that's linked to the Epstein, the non-prosecution agreement back from 2008. A lot of the same lawyers will be shocked to learn were involved in that one. But nevertheless, the DPA explicitly states that if Boeing fails to cooperate in any
right,
further investigation, that is a direct violation of DPA, and that's about the only direct violation of the DPA. And
right,
yet there they've gone and done it.
right.
So that is one thing that I just don't understand why that money cannot be, why you can't find your way into stronger enforcement. I understand that there are a lot of uh, that this is a topic that's, the CPFB has tried to self-fund, the FDIC self-funds to a certain degree, and that it's extremely controversial with the strict constructionist crowd.
Sure.
Um, but that is a question that I'll always have. And the other
Well,
thing is the Air 21 whistleblower statute. I don't know if you know
yeah,
anything about this.
yeah, I do. Yeah,
Um, that if you're a healthcare whistleblower, at least most healthcare facilities that are doing bad things, hurting patients, there's not a whole lot of protection you can get if you have a story about um, patients being hurt, understaffing and neglect that. But generally, when a healthcare institution is doing that, they're also defrauding the government in some way. And you can get money. You can and usually find a lawyer because you can get some money for reporting. Um, there's a chance at least for filing a whistleblower lawsuit about fraud on the government. If you are an aviation whistleblower, you have 90 days to file a complaint detailing how you were retaliated against. And these lawsuits like virtually never work out. I mean, it's so depressing to go through
Yeah.
some of the records. They're also secret. The records are not public. You can
Right.
sort of find little like filings here and there with the decisions. This statute was passed in 1999 before I was paying attention to aviation. I don't know if you know anything about this, but it seems to me like that the whole uh, the whole institution by which aviation whistleblowers are supposed to be protected by the government is completely broken.
Well, yes. I mean, you brought up a whole bunch of connected issues here. First of all, just to clarify for those that aren't aware, right now there are 3 concurrent federal investigations going on at Boeing since the Alaska airline event. Okay, so we have the FAA doing it's a full-blown investigation, not just into what happened with Alaska Airlines, but the larger systemic problems at Boeing. So we'll see where that's going. The National Transportation Safety Board, of course, is immersed in this. And as you pointed out, they've been stonewalled by Boeing, missing records. This is basic stuff, right? And this is not high-tech stuff, right? I learned how to tighten a bolt in shop class in 7th grade, right? I mean, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. This isn't, I can't, take apart an MCAS, but I can tighten a bolt. I mean, some of this stuff is unforgivable. And then the third investigation, which I think is the most interesting and really, in some ways unprecedented, is what you were referring to. That is the DOJ currently right now is investigating it. And you probably know that a few weeks ago, it made the couple of media reports that all of the passengers on Flight 1282, the Alaska Airlines flight, received letters from the FBI on behalf of the DOJ, obviously, saying that you might be a party to a criminal prosecution, right? And notifying them of this, right? So we're in really some uncharted waters. And I do feel I need to say this because I don't say this, with a chuckle, like I'm trying to be cute, but the fact is I may be one of the FAA's most vocal critics over the last 20 years. And I think that's a fair statement, and they would probably agree. But I will say that I've been heartened by this current administrator, Michael Whitaker. So I'll give credit to him and to Secretary Buttigieg. I've been critical of FAA and DOT in the past, but they have stepped up so far. We don't know where it's all going, but they've stepped up in a way that they did not step up in 2019. It was shameful that we were the last country in the world to ground the MAX, after China, after every place else. We should have been the first because we're the ones that certified it. So we'll see where all this is going. But to me, with whistleblowing, it's a complex thing. And I sort of see 2 sides, but one of my concerns is there's a lot of talk from the FAA of, they want to have a sort of non-punitive system in place. So people, if they spot problems, can talk about them. And I get that. And I get the need for it because it can save lives. And, there's a system from NASA, believe it or not, for airline employees. And I use it all the time. You go in there and it's anonymous and you don't say what airline, you don't know if it's Southwest or American or Delta or whatever, but a pilot will go in or a dispatcher or a mechanic and say, well, I just spotted a problem on such and such type aircraft. And everybody better be aware of it, right? And it can lead to, to positive things. But my problem is we don't want to have a system, I don't think, that says, yes, of course, we want everybody to know about the problems. We want to have it aired. But we don't want to have a system that says, well, everybody's going to also be blame free. Because if some of these things are systemic, I'm not talking about, prosecuting low-level people and mechanics and things like that in the chain. But I'm saying if some of these things were known by a company the size of Boeing and not corrected, then there should be punitive action. There damn well should be. And that's, so that's what, for me, the tricky part is because, I get that you want to air all this and you want to correct problems. That's number one. But number two is in any other aspect of life, if you engage in behavior that can be detrimental to someone, let alone, potentially life and death, then you pay a price. And there's a tradition in the United States of not prosecuting commercial aviation, in criminal ways, unless
Right.
it's like out and out sabotage, a terrorist or something. But, in my view, we need to look at just how culpable companies like Boeing are. Because if you knowingly uh, look the other way, and there's enough evidence on the Max, events. To me, the most
Right.
critical period with the Max was those couple of months
Yeah,
between
between October
Indonesia and Ethiopia.
31st and
Right,
March 10th,
exactly.
when
Bingo.
when Boeing not only did not ground the plane, they authorized an additional $20 billion in
Right,
stock buybacks.
right,
Not only did they not ground the plane and authorize an additional $20 billion in stock buybacks, but they actually rolled out with the endorsement of the FAA, this new sort of self-inspection program. I forget
right,
what the actual name of it was, but they eliminated a ton of safety inspectors during that critical time
right.
period.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
David Calhoun, the outgoing CEO of Boeing, will gave an interview to the Washington Post in April, I believe, 2019, that I will never forget, in which she said, "Oh, no, never did we think about grounding the plane after the first crash. It looked like an anomaly,
Yeah.
and I don't regret that decision. It was the right decision at the time."
I mean, what are you
He
supposed to say
didn't
to
regret
that?
like how,
Right, exactly.
yeah,
That's
completely
depraved in my
psychotic
view. It
comment.
really is. It's depraved. Okay.
And
Like that should be looked at by the DOJ, you know.
and they had, so in that case, they had a crash that everyone knew how it happened. It was very simple. It was the software that hijacked the plane
Right,
and caused it to dive nose first into the ocean. And because they wanted to keep this software a secret, they wanted to kind of continue, covering their ass. They didn't do anything about it, and they dawdled, and it was so kind of aggressively criminal, right? I mean, in that
right,
way, like the DOJ had an incredible opportunity there to really go after the malefactors of great wealth that had killed all of these people.
right,
Because there was no room for, there was no more plausible deniability.
right.
Um, I love this from Sean Prochnicki, a Center for Aviation Studies systems engineering professor and former airline pilot who testified. You would think that it would have been made clear after having been directly responsible for two air carrier fatal accidents that at its core causation was 100% about money. And yet we still have no proof that these programs have even entered the lexicon at Boeing Aircraft, despite the hollow comments to the contrary. So it leaves one to wonder, have we gone backwards? His testimony was, totally centered around the idea that actually Boeing has gotten a lot worse since these crashes.
Right.
And I think that impunity is part of the problem there.
Yeah.
Doug is wondering if Uncle Sam has enough inspectors general, and if they have enough muscle.
Well, I think what he means there is inspectors from the FAA. I
Yeah,
mean,
FAA inspectors, yeah.
there is a DOG, excuse me, there is a Department of Transportation Inspector General office. It's very small, but it more does like analysis and studies. So yeah, so we're back to what I was just talking about before, which is the designees. I know some frontline FAA inspectors. Some of them, I earned their confidence when I was working on my book, and I stay in touch with them. And the fact is, they cannot do their jobs. The FAA, as I said, this is a 40-year problem. So we're really, as I mentioned before, I think we're at a crossroads. We know what we say publicly. We say we have zero tolerance. So are we going to step up? I mean, look, I can't speak, intelligently, Mo, as you alluded to before, on some of the issues you raised in terms of, where the United States is engaging in military action this week and next week. But we all know we have the world's largest defense budget, and there always seems to be money for that. Well, I think what we want to do is say right now, in April of 2024, are we going to live up to the stated promise that we have zero tolerance for aviation accidents? If so, then that means we're going to have to put money into hiring experts to do the work that we are asking the companies to self-police on. The self-policing has failed. Boeing is exhibit A, but I could cite other ones with airlines and with repair stations. And, Boeing's really the tip of the iceberg, as incredible as that sounds. So, again, how do we fix Boeing? We're also going to have to fix the FAA, and we need to get inspectors in the pipeline. And it's going to take time, and it's going to take effort, and it's going to take money. But if we don't, then I would argue that we don't have the right to say the next time there's a tragedy, and knock wood, I hope there isn't, but inevitably that's where this type of action leads. We don't get to say in 6 months or a year or 3 years, well, how did this happen? Let's have some more hearings. We know why American aviation companies are misbehaving, because they can, because they don't have oversight from the FAA. If you want, I can come back and we can do a whole nother show just on airline maintenance outsourcing. It's going to make Boeing sound, like a crown jewel, because every airline in the United States sends its maintenance out. Heavy maintenance is what they call it, the big work, the scheduled work. And much of it is done overseas with no FAA oversight. El Salvador, China, Singapore, Brazil, Mexico. Okay. There is no FAA oversight. So I've talked to FAA inspectors. They're assigned to airline A, a US carrier, and they're based where the airline is based, but the work is being done in El Salvador. And I say, well, what do you do? Well, we get reports in electronically.
Right.
And who's writing them? The airline, right? And and then we if we have questions, we send them questions. It's called electronic surveillance. Well, it doesn't work. The real inspectors will tell you, they call it kicking the tires. When I worked in the airlines, I know it was a while ago, it was the 80s and early 90s. I worked in flight operations. I'm an FAA licensed dispatcher. And we would have an FAA inspector walk into the office at 2 o'clock in the morning, unannounced, and they were allowed to do that. And they showed their badge and they would say, what are you doing? What are you working on? What's that? What's that flight plan? Same thing with maintenance. They could walk into a hangar at 4 a.m.
Right.
That's what we need to get back to.
One of the reasons there are so many whistleblowers at Boeing, and there have been a lot, and a lot of whistleblowers who have just been sort of forced into that position by being retaliated against within the company, is that there was, at a certain time, everybody remembers a time when things were different, when standards were upheld. Right now, in a similar phenomenon at Boeing, they are doing the final production of their Dreamliner, their second best-selling plane in South Carolina, where they transferred their operations starting in 2009, I think, and they had no aerospace workforce down there to to speak of. They had to ship a lot of folks out from their other destinations. They did it purely to bust the union, and those planes now that assembly plant produces all of the 787s, and then they get flown to Everett where they get fixed.
Right.
And they they sit around, and the same goes for the 737 Max. They assemble these planes and then they sit there because they can't be delivered to the airlines, because the airlines aren't going to accept them because they need to be fixed. And so there's this massive backlog, hundreds of Maxes, I don't know how many 787s, that are just sitting around waiting to actually be fixed by the guys who really know what to do. It's this and again, goes back to like the penny wise pound foolishness of it, and the way that like there's nothing real about financialized capitalism. They take their money and they forecast a cost savings. They take their money, they do their stock buybacks, they do their dividends on the basis of how much they expect their stupid move to save, and then they the company ends up going under. And this is the other thing, is that Boeing is, I think that it is looking like it might be technically insolvent. I mean, it can't, it is having an enormous problem getting planes out the door. It suspended deliveries of the 787 for 2 years because of the same problems that Solipor says they haven't fixed. And they have all these Maxes sitting in parking lots. They are very lucky. They have only one competitor, and that competitor does not have the capacity to take up pick up the slack. But right now, on a cash flow level, they are in the hole, and they need a bailout. And is this war that bailout? That's what I wonder. And one of the things that got me wondering that, right, was that as the Israel was responding to the Iranian drone attacks, um, which very expected retaliation for their embassy assassination in Syria. A lot of Twitter reports started saying, oh, there's these, KC-35 strato tankers headed to the Middle East. Here's one, here's one. They're all going to the Middle East. Something's happening. This is how you track stealth jets that you can't track, is by tracking their aerial refueling tankers.
Right.
And so somebody on Twitter, I don't know who this person was, but I chuckled when I saw this tweet. From the Denise Folsom, and she asks, let me get this here. Oh my gosh. Wait, why is it 65 years old? Don't we have any newer KC-135 strato tankers? And this gets us back to, the heart of the problem. No, the preeminent, the way that you do aerial refueling of a fighter jet is you use these 65-year-old planes, because Boeing promised, 25 years ago, that it was going to start replacing them with stealth aerial refueling tankers. And then they decided that instead of doing the hard work of mechanically retrofitting these 767s to become aerial refueling tankers, which is kind of complicated and a mess, they were going to handle it all with software. Sort of the same problem with the MCAS problem. They have not been able to produce a tanker that can successfully, sort of do this remote sort of video game style refueling of a fighter jet. So we're stuck using 65-year-old planes. And this is, a testament to what a great company Boeing once was, obviously, how impressive our aviation industry was, back 65 years ago, especially. And if you, read about, my 5-year-old's gone through phases where he's been really obsessed with planes and the X1. And, you go back and you're like, holy shit, like we built a plane that went 5,000 miles an hour. Like, this is incredible stuff. And we did it back in the 50s.
Right.
Now we're spending way more money than we did back then to produce things. And again, it all goes back to this problem that we have of just like, there isn't sufficient oversight. Any regulatory agencies that we have are not actually allowed to look at the fundamental problem, which is, are you trying to get too much profit margin out of this? Like, are you, is this driven by money, and what can we do to stop that? Like, because if the underlying cause is 100% money, as the professor, Prochnicki, sorry, saliently pointed out at the hearing, then you have to be able to get some accountability from the money guys. And that never, ever happens. And it's true with the FAA, it's true with the FDA. It's true across the regulatory system. And it's an enormous problem. I wanted to go to Live Nation though, because we've only got 16 minutes. Sorry, finish your thought.
I'm sorry. Yeah, let me just respond to what you were saying, because you brought up a lot of issues there with Boeing. The litany of problems at Boeing. Look, most of the media attention, and I would argue that most of the general public that knows there's problems at Boeing, if you were to go out to an airport and ask 100 people, what's the problem at Boeing? I think those that would be able to answer that, most of them would say the 737, or specifically the MAX, right? The litany of problems at Boeing in the last 20 years. What by problems, I mean, uncovering manufacturing or safety concerns, delays in deliveries, and the delays just keep building and building, as you're pointing out. It is so far more far ranging than the 737. It's the 787, it's the 777, the 747-8. You talked about the tanker. That the first KC-135 was delivered to the Air Force in 1957. For 20 years, we've been talking about the KC-46 tanker, as you alluded to, right? 20 years of delays and setbacks and, halting the assembly. And even on other military aircraft, T-7A trainer. And then even on, Boeing has the commercial side, the defense side. They also have the space side, right? They built those little dune buggies.
Starliner,
the Starliner for, the spacecraft. That is another, complete mess and a complete shit show.
Abject failure.
Yeah, and so these problems are so far ranging, and the idea that anyone in their right mind would say, well, what we need to fix all this is yet another CEO from GE who was, trained at Jack Welch's feet. It's like, are you kidding me? And so I
Right.
think, the public evidence is enough. I'm not in the boardroom, I'm not behind closed doors, but I don't need to be. There's enough public record and enough public statements coming out of Boeing that makes it crystal clear that they do not get it, and they are not going to fix it internally. That's why I've been, talking so much about the FAA. But I'm also not saying, Boeing, excuse me, Boeing doesn't need to be fixed, but it's not going to be fixed by them. So, our mutual colleague, Matt Stoller, has talked about, anything and everything to save Boeing. And if that means the government taking over the operation of Boeing in order to keep it from collapsing, well, then, so be it. But every option should be on the table.
Absolutely. And that's the thing that, I think I remember when we first started talking about Boeing, Matt and I, he initially thought, well, maybe, breaking it up would, be a possibility. And I said, hey, listen, this company is going to need a bailout. And I don't think that breaking it up is they have outsourced so much. They have broken up. They spun off their fuselage maker, as we
Right.
know, Spirit Aerosystems.
Right.
That's not going to do breakups. Breakups are a much better solution when the problem has to do with some sort of vertical integration, or when
Right. Right.
this is a company that desperately needs to work together better, right?
Right.
Like that, like it needs financialization is at the heart of the
Right.
problem. And I think that's a case where, and putting, and again, I don't understand why we don't have a mechanism for some kind of, partial nationalization of any company that derives a substantial portion of its revenue, certainly probably, of more than half of its profit from the US government in the first
Right.
place. Why
Right.
can't the government nationalize a hospital? Why can't the
Right.
government nationalize, a scammy Medicare Advantage
Right.
insurer? It beats me. They can do it with banks. Why can't we do it with defense contractors? We probably could. They're probably, I'm not a lawyer. But it is something that is going to take sort of creative, and I did feel like that Senate hearing was very promising, but it was very short. And that was another thing that good Ed Pearson had to say. He's like,
Yeah.
there's, he said 5 minutes is nowhere near enough time to tell you, to explain how truly insidious and evil this is. And he's
Right.
one who, his rhetoric has gotten so much angrier over the past 4.5 years since he started blowing the whistle on Boeing. And I think that is why. I mean, I'll tell you, when the Max crashes happened, um, you know, uh, Dominic Gates, the
Yeah.
aviation writer at the Seattle Times, an
Right.
amazing journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner,
Fantastic job. Yeah.
couldn't sell his book, right? He couldn't sell his book. There was one book that sold. It was Robeson's from Bloomberg, great book. But everyone knows Dominic Gates is the authority, and he couldn't
Right.
sell his book. I was helping a director work on a documentary about it after the one-off Netflix documentary came out. They couldn't sell that. There is so much more interest this time around in
Yes.
Boeing and what's wrong, and I think it's because a lot of Americans see what's wrong at Boeing, and they're like, well, that's shit, Boeing is just like my dumbass company,
Right.
but my dumbass
Right.
company doesn't make airplanes.
Right.
Um,
Right. 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 I
so
mean, this was like, and believe me, I don't wax poetic about too many corporations, but they did do things right by and large for about 80 years. They really were a crown jewel. It's not rhetoric, and
right,
it's not hard to figure out what went wrong. Jack Welch, thank you very much. I mean, that McDonnell Douglas merger. I mean, so,
right,
our organization is all about consolidation, and I get where Matt's coming from in terms of breaking up, but I'm with you that first it has to be fixed, because otherwise now you break up and you have 8 companies that are all screwed
Mhm.
up instead of fixing one and then talking about breaking it up. So fixing has to come first, in my view. But it's a big job. And the free market, I'm putting it in air quotes because there's no such thing. The free market, like all the corporate executives like to use that term, it has failed dismally. And if
Yes,
that can happen to what many people outside of aviation, many observers have said that this was America's greatest company for much of the 20th century. If that can happen at Boeing, God help every other company in the country.
And this is where it gets sort of like interestingly bipartisan. I mean, and I don't know what to think about. I mean, it the increasing likelihood that Trump wins, but Matt's sort of paleo conservative friends at American Compass did an interesting paper. I'm sure you've seen it like a year and a half ago about Airbus. And, maybe to fix Boeing, we need to look at, what their extremely successful competitor is. And oh my gosh, it is it's a socialist industrial policy project. It is, and what's really fascinating about Airbus to me, I don't know nearly enough about it, but it's a consortium of four different countries' industrial policies. So it's the French are always fighting with the Germans supposedly, and the
Right.
Spaniards,
Right.
and but they did it right, and they did it for nationalistic or nationalistic reasons. If you go back and look at, they did not want their continent to be left behind.
Right.
And so it shows you that that works. I mean, industrial policy works, and
Right.
it can create functional institutions, far more functional and far more resilient than gangster capitalism, which is what Boeing is.
Right.
Um, can we
And
talk
and
a little
and
bit about airlines, though? Do you
oh, can we?
a second for
You really
airlines?
want to see if you can prod me into talking about airlines? How many hours do we have? Okay, let's
Well,
go.
I was listening to Bloomberg radio on the drive, and
You should be listening to me
everyone's
when you're on the drive, okay? I'm out
I
there talking about
I know
this.
I gotta
Me and me only, okay?
look at your podcast feed. But no, United was the talk of one of the segments, and wow, this is such a hot stock, and the analysis did not get particularly deep,
Mhm.
but we are looking at the possibility that Trump wins with the help of such slogans as Genocide Joe, um,
Mhm. Right.
and we are part of this sort of narrow cast of characters who have actually seen substantial progress being made in our realm of interest by a
Right.
democratic administration embracing kind of like old school New Deal values, and this is in the antitrust
Right.
realm. But is this all about to fall apart? Live Nation looks like the DOJ is about to sue Live Nation. Kind of similar, ticket monopoly kind of going on here. So yeah, just interested in what's going on in the airlines.
Yeah, and so our little ragtag group there, what is there, like 30 of us, and the organization's only 4 years old. Um, it's really incredible to me since I came on board 2 years ago that Economic Liberties has the footprint that it has, for considering, that we're not have been around for decades and we don't have hundreds of staff. But also it's been concurrent with some changes at federal agencies that I don't think it's inaccurate to use the word unprecedented. In my corner, what I've seen in the last year at the DOT and the FAA, I've been around the industry since 1985. Scary, but 39 years. That's when I started working in the airlines. I thought it would be a summer job, but it lasted longer than a summer in 1985, right? And I have been bashing the FAA. And when Secretary Buttigieg first took office, um, I was very critical of him in 2022 and the DOT for not doing enough to rein in the airlines. And guess what? I mean, it's a remarkable and fantastic thing to see. He has turned it around, and he has done things as recently as this week, which we were ecstatic about, where he signed a memorandum of understanding with state attorneys general so that they can have some authority over the airlines for the first time in
Right.
46 years. So we're seeing things we've never seen. And you raise a great point, Mo, because the rhetoric of politics in this country, especially presidential elections, it's what's the best word? It's just stupid. It's childish, and the things that get focused on in an election year are not the things, in my view, that are really going to affect your day-to-day life. And federal agencies affect your everyday life. And so what we've seen in this administration at Department of Justice and at, Federal Trade Commission and what I'm seeing at DOT, and I'm sure our other colleagues are seeing it at other agencies, it's without precedent,
NLRB,
you know,
obviously DOJ. Yeah.
right. And so, I've been, on the advocacy side of the industry. I mean, I worked in the airlines and operations, and then I was a journalist, and then, but on the advocacy side, I've been doing it for more than 20 years between Consumer Reports and AELP. And I can tell you that the darkest period of my entire career, where I actually thought about throwing in the towel and saying, what's the point, were the 4 years of the Trump administration, because his DOT secretary was an absolute nightmare. And that was Elaine Chao, right? Mrs. Mitch McConnell. I mean, it was a nightmare. And I'm being honest with you. Like it affected me personally. Like I was talking to friends and family saying, what's the point? I mean, she was so cold and so indifferent. And can you say shit on this podcast? I mean, she did not give a shit. It was that simple. And she made it
Right.
clear through her staffers. She's the only DOT secretary that never once had a meeting with consumer advocates. Now, I'm not saying that's the end all and be all that have a meeting with us, but she did nothing. During COVID, the airlines, according to Senator Markey, they sat on more than $10 billion in unpaid refunds. You talk about, criminal activity. That's just pure criminal activity. They owed money under the law and didn't pay it and said, no, we're not going to pay it, right? And thanks to federal preemption, which means really only the DOT can have any authority. That's why we were so excited about this state AG thing that happened this week. It was a nightmare in those 4 years. So I understand that I have blinders on because I'm in my aviation
Right.
silo and all that. I get it. But
Right.
I'm also an American citizen, and I read the news too, and I listen to stuff, and I listen to our colleagues talk about all these different industries and healthcare and everything else. And I think, one of the biggest effects of any president is who the hell they appoint at all these agencies, and not just the cabinet level, but going down into the agencies and the directors and the assistant directors and all of those people. And
Personnel is
no one,
policy.
right? And that's they affect our lives day in and out. At the grocery store, at the gas pump, when you buy an airline ticket, when you're paying your cable bill, all of those things. And no one is ever going to tell. And believe me, I was in the school for a long time saying, well, Democrats and Republicans, not a lot of difference between them, this and that. No one now can ever convince me that, Trump and Biden in terms of the people that they appointed are not night and day, right? So it's kind of
Biden and
weird that
Obama,
doesn't. Yes, Biden and
in a lot
Obama,
of cases,
absolutely.
Biden and Obama
Right,
are night and day. Now, I'm not talking
right.
about Judge Nines. I'm not talking about
Yep,
anyone in the Defense Department, and I'm certainly not talking about Blinken.
yeah.
But the on everything kind of domestic economic related, there's been a real shift, and it's really difficult to comprehend the prospect of um 4 years of this all just going backward and nobody caring,
Yeah,
and
yeah, I
everything
know. And that's
it's
why,
sort of being
it's so important to get legislation because, what I've found is that regulations are great, but they can also be, can be knocked down or reversed.
yeah.
And legislation's harder to do that with. But yeah, so we're always sort of fighting two fights.
But yeah, if Trump wins, I mean, I don't see how, barring a massive recession, um we bring inflation. He brings inflation down. I don't really see that happening. It seems like the M&A lawyers and all of the money guys are really banking on a Trump victory. And I can't blame anybody who's uh doesn't feel like voting for Biden this week, especially. But it is just like, it tears me apart.
Well, I mean, I again in my little corner of the world,
Yeah.
um, I know the airline executives love Trump because all they did at the DOT in those 4 years was either ignore existing rules like on paying refunds or roll back rules. And then just as the Trump administration was shutting down and leaving office, they did the most extraordinary thing. They actually passed a rule that would curtail the DOT secretary's authority, right? So the DOT said, we want less power. I mean, it's mind-boggling, right? And so we've been speaking to Secretary Buttigieg about trying to reverse that, right? They basically said, we want to curtail the DOT's oversight. Now, mind you, with federal preemption, the DOT is the only sheriff the airline industry has in the United States. You can't use state legislatures or state courts or even, state AGs until this week, in a limited way. And so, the idea that they would say we're going to have even less authority over an industry that's running rampant and does whatever the hell it wants. I mean, it's mind-boggling. It really is. And so I just wish there was more discussion out there about really bread and butter issues for average person of how the government affects your life. I mean, it's just stupid rhetoric. And I'm not saying there aren't some important issues that get talked about, but
Mhm.
we're talking about everyday life, like government agencies affect your life in ways small and large every single day.
And that's why the Republican feedback, during the State of the Union where he made a big thing where he introduced a junk fees. Oh
Yeah,
my God, people were going crazy, like, wait, why am
yeah.
I agreeing with
Right,
Joe
right,
Brandon right now?
right.
Do you have any predictions about this upcoming summer travel season, Bill? Is it
Yeah,
going to be
I think we're expecting some good news from the Department of Transportation in terms of passenger protections. And trust me when I tell you, good news doesn't come out of the DOT that often. So for those of us who've been in the trenches for decades, if not years, I mean years, if not, see, I can't even talk anymore. You know what I'm trying to say. For those of us been in the trenches fighting for this stuff, we've heard that in the pipeline and being announced very shortly are going to be some new passenger protections, and they're long, long overdue. So full credit to the DOT for doing that. So that's the good news. The bad news is we still have air traffic control shortages. We still have these capacity restraints. Flights are going to be full. I would be worried about fares. There's two schools. Some people are saying, no, fares are going to be okay this summer. I think anytime capacity is restrained and flights are fuller, we see fares go up. So I'm suggesting to people, if you're going anywhere this summer, book now. You can't wait until July. You just, A, you may not get the seats, and B, you'll be paying more. So, but let's hope that these new passenger protections from the DOT do a much better job. 2023 was a lot better than 2022, and that's why.
It absolutely was.
Yeah.
2022 was a there. The Are the airlines doing anything creative in terms of, Boeing obviously is plagued by delays and the inability to supply planes to a lot of their customers. They're trying to look elsewhere, but there's not a whole lot.
Yeah.
Are they, bringing back? I mean, one thing I noticed, Felix Biederman, the inimitable Chapo Trap House co-founder, um, mentioned on Twitter. He got a lot of engagement on this, that they really need to bring back 747s.
Yeah. Yeah.
um and A380s. I mean, A380s, a great plane, can hold a lot of passengers in there.
Yeah.
Are they looking at trying to maybe take cargo planes and put seats on them again or anything like that?
I think they're looking at everything, and they're certainly, I'm sure there've been an awful lot of phone calls between US Airlines and France lately. Carriers that traditionally have used more Boeing products than Airbus, I'm sure are talking more to Airbus. We're even seeing public statements. I've heard some public statements from airline CEOs I've never heard before. I mean, I'm sure they used to say these things behind closed doors, but you have the CEOs of airlines publicly saying we're disappointed in Boeing and
Mhm.
we're looking elsewhere. I mean, they wouldn't have said things like that 10 years ago. They might have said it on a heated phone call, but not to the press. And so, but let's not forget, Airbus has supply chain issues too, not so much related to the quality of their products, but because of COVID and all the supply chain issues that we face worldwide. So there is a shortage of aircraft deliveries, and
Mhm.
there's back orders, there's a backlog, and there's also problems with some of the jet engines too. So when you have those capacity restraints, I mean, the fact is that leads to fuller flights and higher fares. But one of the problems, in my view, with the US airline industry, you brought up a great point, and I don't usually get to get this geeky and talk in depth. It's great talking to you about stuff like this, is, what US airlines want is they want to send up a whole bunch of small planes all day long and
Mhm.
dominate the market. And also what that does for the big three, American, Delta, and United, with their regional partners, American Eagle, Delta Connection, United Express, is that helps keep Spirit and Frontier and Allegiant and Avelo and Breeze and all the ultra low cost carriers out of airports, right? So rather than carry 300 people four
Right.
times a day, they want to carry 100 people 12 times a day, right? And
Right.
saturate the market. And they will say, they always make their internal surveys, which I would love to see, basically have the results that were preordained by them. But they'll say, well, our customers say we want hourly service. So, we're gonna clog LaGuardia.
Blame the customer.
Yeah,
Right.
right. We're gonna clog LaGuardia and National, two of the most congested airports in the country, with more and more, express flights and what it's
Right.
doing to the planet on top of it, right? So I would love it if they were thinking in terms of, bringing 747s out of the boneyard or more 380s or, putting more people on fewer flights. It's better for the planet. It's better for everybody. But the fact is, that's not how they think. They don't want to think in terms of bigger planes. That's how they have
No.
the oligopoly. We have an oligopoly now, American Delta, United Southwest. It's 80% of the market. That is unprecedented. And I underscore that word. I've gone back and done the research from when the first ticket was sold in 1914. We're not only the country that invented the airplane, but also the airline. And we have never had that level of concentration at the top. So, they have, carved up the country and they don't compete with each other in large measure. Sometimes Southwest does, sometimes not. American Delta and United, they don't compete. Is that Bill McGee's opinion? No, you can see it in the DOT's quarterly airfare reports. If you look market by market, if American, Delta, and United, any combination, one, two, or three of them, if they're the only choice, then you are paying the highest fares in the country. And by the way,
Right.
that is overwhelmingly in red states politically.
Right.
But these are issues that cross
No,
political
I mean,
divides. You know,
Wyoming,
uh-huh,
this is like one of the big topics and Wyoming, healthcare and aviation in Wyoming are
exactly.
just abysmal and so insanely expensive.
Right.
And,
In February, I was in Missoula, Montana. I mean, it took all day to get
right,
there. And that's from New York, mind you, and all day to get back. A 2-day trip was a 4-day trip, And next week I'm going to Little Rock, Arkansas. Same thing. So, those are the states that hurt the most. They don't often have ultra low cost carriers. They don't have hubs. They don't have flight frequencies. And that is a direct violation of what we were all promised before my time, but we were all promised in 1978 that the Airline Deregulation Act was going to open up the gates and we're going to have all this access and we're going to have all these new entrants. For a short time, we did until the big guys killed them all. And so, for the last 40 years, we've never had this level of domination. We've never had so few carriers. Scheduled passenger airlines, we only have 12 now. There was at the peak, there was about 70 or 75 in the 80s. And, again, 4 of them at the top with 80%. We also never had such a long period without new entrants. We went 14 years from 2007 to 2021 without a single new passenger airline. Never had that before. And so, for all the talk of competition, the free market competition, they don't want to compete. There was a great essay I just saw the other day. I tweeted about it yesterday, that said, the dirty secret of capitalists is that they talk about competition. They don't want competition. It's the last thing
right,
they want. You think American Delta and United wants to see more startup carriers come in at lower fares? If they wanted to compete, they'd compete with each other. They haven't done that in 20 years. So
right.
it's,
And as Adam Smith wrote in Wealth of Nations, the rate of profit is highest in the countries that are fastest on the road to ruin,
right.
right? Like that is
There you go.
that's the part of Wealth of Nations that
Remind you
no,
of any countries lately?
right? I mean, no, and it's funny because I first read that line, I think back in 2009 when,
Right,
corporate profits were starting to really rebound.
right.
And I think that corporate profits are many, maybe an order of magnitude what they were back then. It's really
Yeah,
quite a country we got here. But no, we should talk about bringing back big planes sometime. Uh,
absolutely. There's so much I'd love to talk to you about, but I can't thank you enough for having me on so we
well,
can.
thank you so much, and thanks for anyone who is watching, especially the retired Boeing employee. And we hope that everyone has a great weekend and orders their flights for the summer right now, because let me tell you, they are not good. I just ordered a bunch of tickets to Germany on a low-cost carrier. I'm a little terrified. I'm hoping we're going to be seated together, but maybe my 5-year-old can bother someone else.
Wow. Okay.
No.
Plenty to talk about here. Plenty to talk about. Yeah. So,
All
like I
right.
say, we're hoping for some good news from the DOT on some of those issues soon.
Well, that's heartening to know that some good news might be in the hopper there.
Yeah.
Have a great weekend, Bill. Have a great weekend, everyone else, and
Thank you, Mo. It was
see
great.
you next week. Bye.
Take care.